Hey, welcome, friend. I'm happy you came back after last week's debacle. And I'm happy to report I even scored us a couple of chairs. You ever get that splinter out of your ass? Come on inside. I've got a good one for you tonight. Hit that like button while you're walking, would you? Well, that's something, ain't it? I knew they were pretty nice chairs, but no one told me they pulled themselves out for you. Well, looky here. It's the Crimson Hour at my new weekend abode, so we better go ahead and get started. 'Cause when that last lick of light fades away, it's gonna be you, me, and whatever's waiting in these walls for the lights to go out. And moving the furniture, for that matter. Our tale tonight is brought to you by author Frederick Pangbourne. Frederick has sadly passed on, but he left a legacy of horror in his wake, and we mean to keep that legacy alive. So without further delay, from our old pal Frederick Pangbourne, I give you Mirrors. An aged black and white photograph of the house had been politely included inside the envelope, along with the neatly folded legal documents from the law offices of Alfred Meyer, Esquire. My first assumption was that I was being properly notified of some sort of legal action against either myself or my wife Rachel. Thankfully, neither she nor I were in the initial process of being sued. Instead, I was being informed of an inheritance in which I was unknowingly included in by my late Uncle Vernon Balzer.
I wasn't even aware you had an Uncle Vernon, dear,
said Rachel, as she cleared the table from this evening's meal of lamb and potatoes. He was what you might refer to as the black sheep of the family. Out of my father's 4 brothers, he was the one who rarely attended any family functions, I answered, not looking up from the letter.
Well, he was apparently very fond of you if you willed his home to you,
she replied, as she stepped back into the dining room. Yes, it would seem that way. I peered over the documents at her. They've included a picture. I lifted the photograph from the table and held it out to her. She smiled as she wiped her hands on her apron and came around the side of the table.
Oh my, Michael. It's not a house, it's a mansion,
she exclaimed as she viewed the picture.
And he willed it to you?
I laughed at her childlike excitement. It would appear so. At least that's what these documents are stating. I gazed back at the paperwork still in my hands and carefully skimmed over the copy of the will.
Where is the house?
She asked, placing the photograph on the table and gathering up a few more plates. I briefly sifted through the 3 sheets of paper that had been included. Uh-oh, here it is. It says the estate is located somewhere in Humboldt County, California.
I've never been to California,
she said, as she left the room to the kitchen. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's somewhere in the northern portion of the state. I called to her and set the paperwork aside. I lifted the picture for a closer examination. The house, as Rachel had stated earlier, was much more than any of the typical homes that we were used to seeing here in Idaho. It was indeed a mansion of looming magnificence. The Victorian building resembled something out of some unique oil painting. The allure of the captivating exterior with its layer of period adornments, witches' caps, gingerbread railings, and a wraparound turreted porch was something that escaped any form of verbal description and had to be seen for it to be truly appreciated. Upon even closer examination, I was able to distinguish an oceanic coastline in the near distance of the home. Rachel had failed to pick up this observation, as she would have surely commented on the building's proximity to the Pacific Ocean faintly visible in the background. I set the photograph aside momentarily and looked to the documents for any additional information that may have been provided on the house. In a small paragraph, it stated that the 8-bedroom home was constructed in 1893, nearly 60 years ago, and provided a full attic, as well as a full unfinished basement that had been converted into a wine cellar.
So, what are our plans regarding this enormous home that has fallen into your lap?
Rachel asked as she stepped back into the dining room and was undoing her apron. I looked up from the paperwork and grinned. My suggestion is that first thing tomorrow I contact this Alfred Meyer at his office and make the necessary arrangements for us to pay a visit to this house as soon as possible. Rachel smiled and wrapped her arms about my neck, kissing me for my aspiring recommendation. The following morning, I proceeded to make the necessary arrangements with the legal assistants at the Meyer Law Office in San Francisco to visit the house. I was assured that my prepared arrival to the Balzer estate would be graciously accommodated upon request, and unbeknownst to me, that my coming would be relayed to the sole occupant who still remained within the mansion, my late uncle's servant, whose name was only referred to as Frederick. After consulting Rachel, we agreed we would depart the rail station in Boise on Thursday of the following week and arrive in Sacramento later that day. Upon arrival in the state's capital, the law firm would provide transportation to escort us to the estate approximately 5 hours north of the city. As they had stated, the law firm kept true to their word and had provided us with a large black sedan that patiently awaited us as we stepped from the rail station that afternoon. The driver, a slender young man by the name of Andrew, promptly accepted our luggage as we neared and stored it in the vehicle's trunk. I placed his age somewhere in his mid to late 20s compared to my own 38. The day bestowed upon us a bright, warm afternoon as we traveled north on Interstate 5 from the Sacramento Valley and eventually redirecting to Route 20, which followed up the state's coastline. With the windows partially opened and the warm Pacific breeze caressing our faces, we soon had easily succumbed to a light sleep in the sedan's spacious back seat. Rachel woke me with a slight shake.
Michael, we're here,
she said softly, recently awakening from her own slumber. Sitting up straight, I rubbed the fatigue from my eyes and beheld the mansion slowly rising to reveal itself over the remote hills ahead of us as we approached. The warming sun was now beyond its zenith and was making its gradual descent toward the rolling waves of the vast Pacific Ocean just off to our left. Gazing out to my right, I observed the acres of low rolling hills and the peaks of the redwood forests in the far-off distance. Turning off the main road, we proceeded between two large entrance pedestals on either side of the property's driveway. Atop of each high concrete pillar was perched a fierce-looking griffin of stone whose dead stares observed our early evening arrival. "Charming," I remarked as the car passed through and made its way up a gradual ascending slope to the entrance of the looming mansion. The faded image of the house did not do the building the slightest form of visual justice as the sedan pulled up to the magnificent facade of this immense baronial castle. Its fanciful detail heightened the grandeur of the house along with its eclectic turrets and gables, a striking design, leaving Rachel and myself in slack-jawed awe as we exited the car and stood within the expansive shadow cast by the towering mansion.
It's like something from a movie,
Rachel muttered as she moved to my side. "I don't believe I could truly admire a sight such as this simply by looking upon a photograph," I said. "One must physically be in the presence to fully appreciate its radiance." While the two of us stood side by side facing the house in an odd hypnotic trance in which the house had easily enchanted us with, Andrew was already moving our cumbersome baggage from the sedan's trunk and hauling it up the stairs of the wraparound porch, where he neatly stacked the luggage to the side of the front door. Once our baggage had been completed, it was the sound of the trunk slamming closed that abruptly pulled our stare from the mansion.
"I was told to give this to you, sir."
Andrew was handing me a manila envelope.
"It's the copies of all the paperwork pertaining to the house, including an additional copy of the will."
As I accepted the envelope, he was cramming his hand into his pant pocket.
"Before I forget, here are the spare set of keys."
He held out a tiny ring with 2 dangling keys. Thanking the young man for his efforts, I generously tipped him and wished him safe travels back to the city. As the sedan rounded in the circular driveway and retreated to the main road, Rachel and I took one last glance at the house, then proceeded up the stairs of the front porch.
"Should we knock?"
she asked, as we stood facing a set of solid dark mahogany doors. The front doors were set with a complex stained glass insert in each face. The right door depicted the image of an angelic female displaying her set of unfurled wings while wielding a sword, as the left displayed the twisted form of some demonic being clutching the familiar barbed pitchfork. Each segmented pane was done in a dazzling exhibit of colored glass that seemed to be enhanced even more vividly in the reflecting rays of the setting sun. "I don't see why we should. The house is now technically ours," I answered with a smile and slipped one of the keys into the lock. The key easily turned within the door, and at the sound of the lock disengaging, I casually pushed them both inward. At the opening of the portals, a slight breeze rushed from the depths of the home and gently stroked our faces as it passed by. The breeze carried with it a peculiar odor of what I could only describe as a distinctive mixture of the home's musty, stagnant interior and a faint trace of some type of fishy malodor. I could almost taste the pungent smell on my tongue and grimaced.
"The first thing we need to do is open some windows. The fresh ocean breeze will do the house a world of good,"
Rachel stated as she stepped inside. Leaving our baggage on the porch for the time being, I followed her through the threshold. Inside the sprawling interior, I again felt as I had when I stood outside, admiring the home's massive exterior, small and inconsequential. "The office said that my uncle's servant was still living here," I said as I stepped further into the foyer and continued to absorb my new surroundings. I ran a finger over the surface of a nearby end table, where a tall decorative vase sat. "From the lack of upkeep, I'd say he's probably away on vacation," I said, as I brushed a wad of dust from my fingertips.
"This place is like some immense castle, Michael. You can't expect one man to possibly do everything,"
Rachel answered back. At that moment, a door opened and closed from some unknown location toward the back of the house, and I could hear the approaching sound of footsteps on the runner carpet in the far hall. As the footfalls drew nearer, I found Rachel now at my side. From the main hall that ran past the elaborately wood-carved staircase in the foyer appeared a tall elderly man in a finely pressed black suit typically worn by servants. The man was slender in appearance. His thinning gray hair was slicked and combed back. His steel blue eyes hid behind a pair of thin wire-framed glasses which sat perched on his nose.
"Good evening,"
he said calmly, bowing slightly at the waist.
"I hope your journey was pleasant. I am Frederick. I served your late uncle before his passing, and now, young Master Balzer, I serve you."
I chuckled at the formal introduction, since greetings had never been presented to me before, and I found it somewhat humorous to have it done to someone as commonplace as myself. I approached Frederick and shook his hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Frederick. I'm Michael, and this is my wife, Rachel." I gestured to her, and she nodded and smiled. "I apologize for not knocking or calling for you."
"This is your home now, young master. There is no need for apologies."
He craned his neck to the side and took notice of our baggage still on the porch.
"Feel free to wander about, sir, and explore the house. Get a lay of the land, as they say, while I bring your bags up to the master bedroom."
Before I could interject and stop the man to let him know there was no need for him to carry our baggage to the upper floors by himself, he was already on the porch gathering what he could manage. The last thing I wanted was my uncle's lone servant, who had toiled over him through the countless years, to perish from a cardiac arrest by carrying our luggage up the steep staircase like some Arctic Sherpa on his first day with us. I turned to relay my concerns to Rachel, but she had left my side and found her way into a spacious sitting room off the main hall. I gave Frederick a second glance before deciding it was probably best if I did not watch his labors, and moved into the sitting room. "Magnificent," I said aloud as my head swiveled on my shoulders and took in as much as I could visually absorb of the luxurious chamber.
"Look at this,"
Rachel said behind me, and I turned toward her. She was making her way to an enormous stone fireplace at the far wall. She stopped short of the hearth and motioned to what hung over the mantel. A large, flat, rectangular object was fastened to the wall, and I say object because whatever it was covered by a sheet of brown wrapping paper making its identity unknown. I could only surmise that it was a painting of some sort.
"Odd that it's covered. I wonder why."
Your guess is as good as mine. I walked to the fireplace. Perhaps it was a portrait that my uncle wasn't fond of. Rachel held a finger to her lip as if suddenly remembering some forgotten thought, and hurried from the room and back into the main hall. I followed out of curiosity.
"I thought I saw that,"
she stated as she pointed to another object on the foyer wall. This brown paper-wrapped object was oval-shaped.
"They covered another one up."
Frederick had closed the front doors as he hauled in the last of the luggage. I held out a hand and lightly touched his shoulder as he passed, briefly stopping him. "Frederick, we noticed that some of the paintings have been covered. Is there a reason for this?" I pointed to the oval hanging.
They are not paintings, sir. They are mirrors."
He turned his gaze from the wrapped mirror and continued up the staircase.
"It was your uncle's dying wish that all mirrors in the house stay covered."
"That is an odd request," I said, as we watched Frederick climb the stairs.
"Why would someone want all the mirrors covered?"
Rachel added. "Perhaps he was a vampire?" I chuckled and put an arm around her. In the days that followed, we thoroughly explored the aged mansion with its numerous rooms and long winding halls. It was still surreal that this magnificent house had fallen unexpectedly into my lap and was now, if I so wished it, my possession. The house was without a reasonable doubt much more than the two of us required, and at times I wondered if it was worth moving from our quaint home in Idaho into a home so immense. It almost seemed to be a shameful waste of living space, as it was just Rachel and I, and of course Frederick. Nevertheless, we kept such thoughts behind us for the time being, as our time here was limited to a few more days, and there was much more to discover of the mansion and its veiled mirrors. One room in particular that I had come across was situated in one of the high turrets facing the coast. The door to this room was locked, and locating the key had become somewhat of a mystery. Even when I inquired to Frederick of the room and its locked door, he simply stated the room was my uncle's private study, and the whereabouts of the key were unknown to him. I found his answer vague and unconvincing, and decided to find my own way into the secured area. I decided for reasons unknown to keep the room's presence from Rachel for the time being, until I was able to enter and see inside for myself. One item that had caught her specific interest was located on the second floor. At the end of the floor's main hall, a very large and covered mirror had been placed. The mirror was nearly as tall as me and just over 3 feet wide. It was as of now the largest mirror we had encountered in the house. I had not been there at that very moment, but the giant mirror had captured her interest with the most anxious curiosity, and she took it upon herself to peel away a portion of the brown paper and glimpse the mirror and its frame. As a woman, it was causing her great dissatisfaction not being able to view herself as she dressed in the morning and set her hair. Thus, the opportunity to gaze into a mirror had grown to an obsessive level. She had torn back a 6-inch section of the paper when Frederick had come upon her and immediately rectified her actions by rushing to the mirror and pushing her hand away. He then quickly taped the torn section of paper back into place and offered her a curt apology before returning to his daily tasks. To say such a rash reaction took her aback was an understatement. I assured her I would speak to Frederick that evening regarding the incident. That night, as Rachel and I sat at the extended oak dining room table finishing our evening meal, I brought the matter up to Frederick as he cleared the table. "Frederick, may I speak to you of a matter that has been brought to my attention?" I suddenly began.
But of course, young master.
He paused at his task and directed his attention to me. "Rachel tells me that you—" I tried to make this sound as tactful as possible. "Interrupted her a tad harshly when she was attempting to view the large mirror on the second floor. What is the true reasoning behind the covering of all the mirrors here?"
As I stated, sir, it was your uncle's dying wish that—
Yes, I realize it was his dying wish," I cut in. "But what is the real purpose behind it? Why?" He stood unmoving for a few seconds, still holding a few plates in his hands until he finally said,
The covering of the mirrors after someone dies is so they do not find their way back.
"Find their way back?" I almost wanted to laugh. "I don't understand. Who's trying to find their way back?" Frederick resumed cleaning off the table.
It is of no matter, sir. Some things are best left unexplained.
Rachel glared at me from across the table with a puzzled look. Again, Frederick was attempting to deflect the question with another of his vague answers. "Frederick!" My voice was raised slightly and took on a stern tone. "I'm sorry, but I must insist that you do explain. I realize we are new to this house and that many of my uncle's daily affairs are not known to us, but, being that he was my uncle, I again insist that you explain yourself fully." Frederick paused again, his back to me as he was preparing to whisk away the stack of dishes. Slowly, he turned about and carefully set the dishes back on the table. He straightened himself and sighed.
You are correct, sir. He was your relative by blood. My apologies for being so discreet on the matters you speak of. If you are to stay in this house, then it is imperative that you become familiar with your late uncle's affairs.
I exhaled heavily as it was obvious that there was no longer any need to pursue any form of verbal strong-arm tactics, and that Frederick was now willing to bend and relay to us what we wished. "Thank you," was all I could say.
Perhaps if the young master would accompany me upstairs, I can explain your uncle's last wishes more appropriately.
I threw a glance at Rachel. She nodded vigorously and forced a thin smile. Removing my napkin from my lap, I stood from the table. "I'll be just a moment, dear." Again she smiled and nodded. I motioned for Frederick to lead the way, and the two of us departed from the dining room. I followed him from the room and into the darkening interior of the mansion. After several familiar turns, I soon realized that he was leading up to the west turret, where the locked room was located. He stopped at the door to the room and turned to me, leisurely pulling an iron key from his breast pocket. I opened my mouth to protest his earlier lie regarding the key's placement, but instead said nothing, allowing him to unlock the door. With the lock unsecured, he gently pushed the door inward, allowing me to enter first. The room was circular. Its walls were of stone and mortar, and the floor was constructed of polished wood planks. Only one window had been positioned in the room across from the door. The arched window was cast in an iron frame and faced the ocean. Set beneath the window, a small table of dark wood was placed. The centerpiece was a heavy open tome nestled in a stand. The book, even from my standpoint, was visibly old and time-worn, its pages beige in color. White, unlit candles surrounded the book like tiny soldiers standing erect and on guard. On either end of the table sat a tall, grotesque statue of something resembling both man and squid. My eyes roamed over the black candelabras lining the walls and the strangely painted symbols on the floor. The same wretched odor that was released from the bowels of the mansion upon our initial arrival lingered even stronger here.
I don't understand,
I muttered, still on the door's threshold. What is this?
Your uncle's affairs, sir.
I was shaking my head in bewildered confusion, refusing to step into the room. What does this mean? I don't...
The late Mr. Bowser was a master of his craft, sir. His fondness of the old ones who dwelt in the deep was an unquenchable obsession. He spent untold hours locked in this room, studying the ancient tome and conducting its rituals, encrypting the stars, hoping to reach out to them in their cold depths and satisfying their demanding needs. In the end, he awakened them from their timeless slumber and drew their attention. This was not enough, though. He wanted more. He wanted to share in their vast knowledge of the cosmos and strengthen his own being and mortality.
What happened? Did he achieve what he was seeking? I said softly as I braced myself within the door's threshold and stared out the lone window to the endless sea beyond.
He did. He reached out into the dark, vast unknown void, and they answered his beckoning call. He entered this chamber one evening and never left. It wasn't until 3 days later that I allowed myself in and found he was no more. Only his torn and shredded clothing remained in a pile on the floor. I can only surmise that the great old ones granted him what he implored of them, not realizing the inevitable toll they would exact.
I turned from the room and faced him. And the mirrors? Frederick sighed.
I believe your uncle knew what was to come, and that if he were to succeed, that he should not, for whatever reason, be allowed to return to this house and back into the world of man. Immediately after his demise, I covered the mirrors so that he could not find his way back. They've remained covered ever since.
Why, though? I leaned against the door jamb and tried to absorb all I had just heard, attempting to reconfigure the tale into some type of sensible explanation that would not prove myself mad for believing in its fantastic outcome. Why did he not want to come back? Frederick said nothing, staring at me with an expression of unemotional stone that refused to offer any form of resolution. It was then that a scream erupted from somewhere below us in the house. It was Rachel. Without hesitation, I pushed past Frederick and raced through the narrow halls and down the winding stairs from where the scream had come. It was in the second-floor hall that I found her. My mind was still confoundedly trying to grasp the story that had recently been relayed to me when I witnessed the brain-numbing sight. The large mirror at the hall's end had been stripped away of its paper wrapping, exposing the thick, ornate frame and what should have been a tall pane of reflective glass. Instead, no glass existed. Beyond the mirror's frame was an obsidian abyss filled with an obscured swirling mist. Standing just beyond the mirror facing me was Rachel. For the briefest moment, I wondered why she stood there unmoving and insanely frightened, instead of rushing to me. I then saw why. Reaching out from the abyss were a number of long, slender black arms ending in hands with elongated talons. They gripped her arms and legs. The hands had even gripped handfuls of her dress, attempting to pull her through the frame and into the black world beyond. Her arms were outstretched and her hands clutched at the frame for support as she was slowly being drawn in. Her eyes were bulging wide, and tears streaked her terror-stricken face. She screamed my name. I rapidly took several steps forward down the hall, but faltered when I saw what else was emerging from the swirling mist. Twisted red tentacle-like appendages slipped from the void and were wrapping themselves around her. The glistening tentacles brought the pagan images of the statues from the forbidden room to my mind. She was in mid-scream when a tentacle slithered out and found her head, coiling itself around her face and closed over her mouth and one eye. "Rachel!" I screamed to her and reached out in a futile gesture of a failed rescue. It was then that she was suddenly jerked back with unearthly force, pulling her off the frame and into the abyss, where she was seen no more. I fell to one knee and cried out. Within a matter of minutes, my entire world had been somersaulted into some nightmarish realm of immeasurable proportions. I knew in my very soul that I had lost her forever to some indescribable and horrendous fate. Why did she have to unveil the mirror? Why?
Michael.
A deep, rasping voice called out my name, and I peered up to the mirror. Stepping from the shrouded void was the naked form of a hairless man. The man's flesh was a bloated, pale, bloodless color, and his body oddly misshapen. I squinted my eyes, and in an alarming recognition, realized that it was none other than the late Vernon Balzer. "No," I found myself saying aloud.
"Yes, Michael."
It spoke in that rasping, gargled voice.
"I have returned to my home."
"No!" I screamed at the abomination as it stepped fully from the mirror and into the hall. I climbed to my feet and watched as it opened its arms in a welcoming embrace and smiled. There was movement beneath his skin, as if unseen living things squirmed about under the pale flesh. His smile revealed toothless gums, and his eyes were without color, like small pallid orbs. His contorted body glistened in droplets as if he had just risen from a body of water.
"Your beautiful wife has given herself for my rightful return." She graciously opened the doorway to their detestable world and has shown me the way home.
From his face, small worms sprouted from the very flesh and wiggled about as they grew.
"Come and welcome your uncle back, my lad."
I screamed in some incoherent roar and rushed at the vile being. Despite the visual horror I was confronting, the final image of Rachel's terrified face as they pulled her into the mirror fueled me with such rage that it threatened to release its destructive fury onto an object. Vernon's flesh was as cold and slick as it appeared as I grappled with this resurrected monstrosity. He laughed with his toothless maw as we wrestled, my fingers sinking into him as if he possessed no bones. His grip was firm on me as we struggled in the hall, bouncing each other from one wall to the next while trying to maintain our footing. My enraged efforts were of no concern to my opponent as he continued to laugh. At times, his face would press close to my own, and I could feel the tiny worms caressing and poking at my cheeks. The powerful stench of rotten fish filled my senses. As my strength waned and his continued unwavering, I felt his skin swelling in my grasp, and watched as albino-hued tentacles ruptured from his body and entangled my own limbs. He howled in laughter at the fear that welled in me, the flaming anger inside me now dwindling to embers. As we spun once again from one wall, I saw he had taken a step back, drawing him close to the open mirror. I took this opportunity to release the drained reserves of my strength into one last forceful push that sent both our entwined bodies through the frame and into the blackness beyond. I could hear my uncle's laughter quickly turn to wails of misery. The fall into the mirror felt as if I had been plunged into a pool of dark, frigid water. Even the world around me held the experience of being underwater. The slow, restricted movements, the sensation of deep flowing currents brushing over me in my weightless state. Yet there was no lack of oxygen. I could still breathe with no suffocating restrictions. Vernon's struggles were no longer directed at seizing me now, but trying to break free of my clutches and swim to the rectangular window in the pitch-black abyss. Like a shining beacon in the dead of night, the defined shape of the mirror and the waiting hall beyond the illuminated passage back to the world of men. I held tight and tried to wrestle my way ahead of the monster, pushing it down with my feet into the endless depths as I fought to reach the exposed portal. My outstretched fingers were now just a foot away when Frederick appeared in the hall and was rapidly making his way to the mirror. Vernon was now wrapping around my legs like some constricting python as I slowly edged ahead of him to the open mirror. I screamed out Frederick's name, but like being submerged in water, the sound was muffled and deadened. I looked down and saw that Vernon was now more of some repulsive squid than he was man, and tentacles of great lengths were pushing their way from his torso. I turned my gaze to the portal and saw that my fingertips were within a fraction of an inch of piercing the gateway between the two worlds. I screamed out his name again, and it was then that he looked up and gazed into my face. "Pull me through!" I shouted. Instead, the torn brown paper was folded back into place and replaced with newer paper. I screamed again as my surroundings grew darker as the light from the hall was being shut out. The squid was now completely entangling me as it dragged me away from the mirror. Frederick promptly covered the last opening in the mirror, and my world was cast into a cold, impenetrable blackness. I screamed into the void. And that was Mirrors by Frederick Pangbourne. A good reminder that self-reflection isn't always the answer. A little about the author. Frederick Pangbourne was a short story author with over 100 stories to his credit, and the majority of them in publication. He was a retired law enforcement officer and former U.S. Marine. And again, a special thanks to his brother Robert Pangbourne, who's partnered with us to keep Frederick's legacy going. Robert himself is an amazing artist who we insist that you check out. You can find him on Facebook at RF Pangbourne. That's simply spelled Pangborn. Check out the show notes for a link to his Instagram. His paintings are fucking horrifying. Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Fred. Gone but not forgotten. The Crimson Hour is a production of the Sinister Somnolence Network. All narration and audio production by yours truly. Co-produced by Geoff Sturtevant. You can follow me on Facebook for news and upcoming releases on both this show and Drew Blood's Dark Tales, my Friday night show on Chillin' Tales for Dark Nights. I hope to see you there too. But hey, while we're here, please hit all those obligatory buttons and share if you don't mind. We'd really appreciate it. The Crimson Hour is accepting submissions. If you've got a story or two you'd like to be featured on this show, send it to drewbloodhorror@gmail.com. If selected, you'll get the full treatment. Well, the Crimson Hour is over, and you know what that means. Things are about to get pretty dark around here. So much for a quiet getaway, huh? Gonna have to get me one of those squeegee boards. So thanks for joining me tonight, friends. A few window treatments, a good dusting, and a little exorcism, and pretty soon, we'll all feel right at home here. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week at the Crimson Hour.